Welcome, everyone, to the 2021 Forages Conference held in conjunction with the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association Convention. My name is Becky Thompson, and I work with the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association. While we are disappointed that we couldn't be together tonight in person in Owensboro, we are very excited to bring to you this evening a set of fantastic speakers and some great information. I encourage you to visit the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association website at www.kycattle.org to register for our upcoming business meeting on this Friday afternoon at 1 p.m. We are recording tonight's sessions, and we will be sharing the video links next week for your viewing at your own time. For any of our University of Kentucky Extension agents that are with us, if you would please put your name and county in the chat box, we will make sure to share this list with to get your in-service training hours. Please make sure you stick around to the end of each session this week for a chance to win $100. We will be announcing a winner at the end of tonight's session, so make sure you don't leave early. But before we get started, I just want to thank our 2021 convention sponsors for their support this year. We will be hearing from several of them throughout the evening tonight. Our Forages Planning Committee has done a great job of putting together a great conversation for you this evening on improving hay quality in Kentucky. At this time, I would like to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Chris Teutsch, for a program welcome and some housekeeping tips. Chris?
Hi, it's my pleasure to be with you tonight. And the title of our conference tonight is Improving Hay Quality in Kentucky. Hay is an integral part of cow-calf operations, and often the quality is not quite what we want it to be. And the goal of tonight's session is really to give you some practical advice on how to improve hay quality for your operations. Improving hay quality can make a big impact in keeping condition on animals as you're moving through winter, and also reduce the amount of supplementation that you need in your overwintering system. So it's really, truly a pleasure to have you and to have our speakers with us tonight. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and get started with the conference. I'm going to be your first speaker tonight, and I'll just give myself a short introduction. I grew up on a small crop and livestock farm in Northeast Ohio. After high school, I needed direction, and I ended up in the Navy for 4 years. After I finished the Navy, I spent a year in Europe, in Germany, working and living on a German dairy farm, going to a German agriculture school. Came back and finished a bachelor's and a master's at the Ohio State University in forage management. And then I had the honor to come to the University of Kentucky, where I received a PhD in forage physiology and management. Immediately after graduate school, I was lucky enough to get hired on the great land grant institution in Virginia. And I spent 17 years at Virginia Tech before coming back in 2017 to the University of Kentucky to take Dr. Lacefield's spot in Western Kentucky at the Grain and Forage Center of Excellence. So it's great to be with you tonight. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
When you need a trusted livestock partner to ensure you are maximizing your profit and minimizing your risk, and you have the financing you need, United Producers is here. With a network of livestock marketing options throughout the Midwest, comprehensive risk management services, and competitive rates and flexible terms for financing, United Producers has the solutions you need. We are here to customize products and services to help your farm succeed. So call or click today to learn more about United Producers.
Hello, I'm Chris Teutsch, Forage Extension Specialist located in Western Kentucky at the University of Kentucky Research and Education Center near Princeton, Kentucky. And the topic I'm going to be talking on today is hay quality in Kentucky, a historical perspective. I've got two things that I'd like to cover today. The first is just an overview of hay sampling. Getting a good sample is absolutely paramount to getting good forage test results. So we're going to just go over how to get a good sample. And then we're going to take a look at 14,000 hay sample results from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, and I'll have those summarized for you. So let's start out with hay sampling. And our goal of hay sampling is to get a sample that represents the hay that we're going to be feeding to our livestock. This is absolutely essential because the results of the forage test are only going to be as good as the hay sample that you submitted. So it's absolutely critical that we get a good uniform sample that's representing the different hay lots on our particular farm. And that's going to allow us to take that forage, supplement it if needed, and then feed it accordingly. Maybe we'll feed the higher quality hay when the animals have higher nutritional requirements. So the first thing to remember is that we should always sample each hay lot separately. And what a hay lot is a single cutting from the same field. So I have field A, first cutting, that's one hay lot. I could have field A, second cutting, that's a second hay lot. Or I could have field B, first cutting, that would be a third hay lot. So we want to sample each hay lot separately. We always want to use a properly maintained hay probe to collect samples. Simply sticking your hand in a bale and pulling a handful of hay out is not an adequate way to get a representative sample of your hay. So you have to use a properly maintained hay probe. And by properly maintained, what I mean is sharp. We want to be good and sharp so it cuts through the bale. It's not pushing things aside, but actually cutting through them. So it's important that we keep our hay probes good and sharp. And we want the length of our hay probe to be at least 16 to 18 inches long. We don't want to get much shorter than that. We want to be able to get in and get a good sample of what's inside of that bale. We want to collect at least 20 cores per hay lot. So for example, if I had a hay lot, remember a hay lot is that single cutting from a field. Say I got 100 bales off of that hay lot. I would want to go through and sample every fifth bale. 5 times 20 would be 100. And that's going to give me a good representative sample of that hay lot. Now, when we sample round bales and square bales, we sample from different places. On a round bale, we'll sample from the side of the bale, as you can see in this photograph right here. On a large square bale or a small square bale, we'll sample from the end of the bale and probe inside of the bale. One important thing to remember, and sometimes people make this mistake, is that we want to submit the entire sample that we took. We do not want to subdivide those sample cores. And the reason for that is if you look at this particular photograph, all the small particles have migrated to the bottom of this bag. The small particles are associated with the most nutritious part of that sample. So the leaves, say from a clover or an alfalfa plant, or even from a grass plant, those smaller particles at the bottom of that bag, if I reach in there and I grab a handful of forage, what I'm going to be getting is these larger, more coarse pieces of stem and larger leaves. And that's really going to alter the outcome of my forage test results. So I want to make sure that I submit that entire sample, let the lab grind that entire sample, and then once it's into a homogeneous grind, they can subdivide it and get a good representative sample of the sample that you sent in. So I don't have time today to go over everything, but we do have a brand new hay sampling publication, and it's AGR 257. You can find it by simply Googling hay sampling, University of Kentucky, AGR 257, or by going to our Forages website. Just Google UKY Forages, it'll bring up our Forages website. The other resource that I wanted to draw your attention to was a brand new video on our KY Forages YouTube channel. If you want to find this video, all you need to do is simply Google KY Forages YouTube, and it'll bring up our webpage, and it should be the video near the top of the list. Okay, let's jump right into the sample set that we're going to be talking about today. And I want to tell you a little bit about the sample set and then the way I analyze that sample set. So Kim Fields at the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, and she's in charge of the hay testing program, was nice enough to provide a sample set of 14,067 samples, and they ranged from a time period of 2007 to 2017, so about a 10-year period. And there are a number of different hay types in there. And those hay types, of course, when you submit a sample, you have to write down what hay type it is. They're what I call self-described. That means they may be different than what I would consider, say, for example, a grass-clover mixture. I'd like to see 20 or 30% clover on a dry matter base in a grass-clover mixture. A lot of times people will put down grass-clover mixture if they've got 3 clover plants in a 10-acre field. So it's not a objective description, but more of a subjective description. It's important to remember that. The first thing I did with these 14,000 samples is I went through them and I deleted what I considered outliers, and these are the criteria that I use for outliers. If a sample is less than 5% crude protein or greater than 30, it doesn't really fit what I consider a typical forage sample, so I deleted it. Same thing with acid detergent fiber, less than 20 or greater than 55, I delete it. Same thing with neutral detergent fiber. And we'll talk about what these are in just a couple slides. If it was less than 40 or greater than 75, I delete it from the sample set. And the reason you do that is you don't want extreme samples to influence the average of the sample set. And then I regrouped the samples, and I grouped them into the following categories. There was more categories that I kind of put together into some of these individual categories that I defined here. And they're alfalfa grass, and then we've got a grass, a clover grass, small grain annual ryegrass, so that kind of covers our winter annual grasses. And then I've got last category is warm season grasses. And that includes introduced warm season grasses like crabgrass and Bermuda grass and sorghum Sudan grass, and native warm season grasses like blue stem or Indian grass or switchgrass. And then I predicted total digestible nutrients. So I did not use the value from Kentucky Department of Agriculture because I feel like for grass samples, especially, their equation is under predicting the energy in the hay samples. So I used a Virginia Tech equation that's kind of in the middle of the road. There's a whole bunch of different total digestible nutrient equations out there, or energy equations. And I chose one that was kind of in the center that I was familiar with. And then I went through and calculated summary statistics for about 10,000 samples that were remaining. And they included sample number, the minimum value, the maximum value, the average, the median. The median is very similar to the average, except it's less affected by values on either end of the spectrum. And then standard deviation, that tells us how much variation there was within the sample set. Now, one thing that I need to mention here, and this is not a fault of the Kentucky Department of Agriculture sample set, but it's the same for a sample set from any laboratory. the sample set is likely going to be skewed towards better quality hay samples. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that the people who took the time to take a hay sample, to pay for it, to send it into the Kentucky Department of Agriculture for analysis, they're going to be your better forage and livestock producers. And what that means is that we're already getting a sample set that's going to be on the high end of forage quality versus the guys that really have never submitted a forage sample that are going to be on the lower end. So we tend to skew, this data set tends to be skewed towards the better hay quality samples in the state. Nothing you can do about that. The only way we could get a really representative sample was if we randomly selected cattle operations in the Commonwealth and then went out and sampled them. And then that would give us a feel for both the better quality producers and the producers that have lower hay quality. So let's jump into the analysis, and this is from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture hay testing program, and this is crude protein. So this first line is the number of samples, and these are going to be the same for each table that I'm going to show. This is the minimum value, the maximum value for crude protein. So the highest one, the lowest one, the average, and then the medium, which is very similar to average, but less impacted by extremes on either end, and then the standard deviation. So when we balance a ration for an animal, and Jeff Lemcoer is going to be talking about this in the next presentation, we basically balance it for crude protein and energy, or total digestible nutrients, for beef cattle. And this is just showing the crude protein requirement, since we're looking at crude protein for different cattle classes. For example, a beef cow that's lactating, so she had a calf and she's lactating, she's going to need somewhere between 10 and 12% crude protein. A dry cow that's in mid-gestation, she's going to need, somewhere closer to 7% crude protein. So let's take a look at the average crude protein. And I think everybody knows what an average is, but a good explanation of an average is the three ag economists that went duck hunting. So they're in their blind, a duck flies over, the first ag economist shoots at it, and he goes in front of it. The second one shoots and goes behind it. And the third ag economist yells, "We got it." That's what an average is. So average is far from perfect, and you can't balance a ration off an average. That's the point that I want you to take home today. You cannot balance your ration off of an average. You have to have a hay test for your particular hay lot. So the average, as you would expect, if we look at alfalfa and alfalfa grass mixtures, these are guys growing these are going to be good forage producers who are doing a good job managing their forages for the most part. They have a range in average crude protein of around 16.5 to around 20%, and sometimes higher depending on the particular sample. Now, if we jump here to grass and grass clover, here are our last four categories: warm season grasses. These are cool season annuals, clover grass mixes, and grasses. We're going to be bouncing around 11 to 12% for crude protein, which is still pretty phenomenal when you think about a grass hay sample. That's going to meet the requirements of a lactating brood cow in most cases. And generally speaking, when we talk about deficiencies in forage systems, sometimes we'll have a crude protein deficiency, but a lot of times we're going to have energy deficiencies in forage systems, more often than crude protein. Now, it's important to remember that there's bad samples in every category. And you're saying, how in the world could you grow alfalfa hay that's 7.5% in crude protein? Well, maybe it rained for 6 weeks straight and we went way past early bloom into seed pod formation, so the quality is going to be very low. And then on top of that, I had a leafhopper infestation, which is going to reduce leaf quality. and then I cut it, and then it rained for 2 weeks. So all of a sudden, I've got nothing left but stems. I'm going to have a very low crude protein concentration. That holds true for all of these different categories. So again, it's very important to know the forage quality of each particular hay lot so that you can supplement accordingly. This is next parameter we're looking at is neutral detergent fiber. In neutral detergent fiber, if you look down here, is what's left over after we digest that forage sample in a neutral detergent solution. This is also called Van Soest analysis, which includes neutral detergent and acid detergent fiber. And after we just digest it in this neutral detergent solution, what we have left is cell wall, the cell wall constituents, which includes hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, and then some fiber-bound minerals. And the reason that this is important to us is that neutral detergent fiber is related to dry matter intake. So as neutral detergent fiber increases, the amount of forage or the dry matter intake of the animal decreases. So we will use this in our cow-calf hay supplementation tool that Jeff Lemcoer will talk a little bit about. So that's important to know this particular value of neutral detergent fiber. Generally speaking, the crude formula that's used to determine dry matter intake is 120 divided by the neutral detergent fiber. It's a crude estimation, but it's about as good as we're going to get. So for example, if we had a 60% NDF, we would take 120 divided by 60, and it will come out to 2% of the body weight. So that means a 1,200-pound animal could eat 2% of her body weight in forage. So if we look at the average neutral detergent fiber, we're going to see, of course, if we look at alfalfa and alfalfa grass, is considerably lower. And that's one of the advantages of legumes, and in particular alfalfa and alfalfa grass mixtures, is that it has lower NDF. So what's that mean in terms of feeding that forage material? That means that that material is going to move through that animal at a greater rate. So we're going to be able to get more forage moving through that animal versus something that has in the low to mid 60s in terms of NDF on average, which would be our grass species. And again, you know, just because we have good average values, we can have bad hay samples too, which have very high levels of neutral detergent fiber, which is going to limit dry matter intake. So just think about this for 1 minute. I've got a low quality hay, and I've got a really high NDF on that hay. So it's kind of like a double whammy on the animal. The animal needs more nutrition than that hay can provide, and it just can't eat enough of that hay to get that nutrition. So this is acid detergent fiber, and this is kind of related a little bit more to digestibility of that forage. So what we do is we take that forage material and we dissolve it in what we call an acid detergent solution. And that acid detergent solution leaves us with cellulose and lignin. And that's a cell wall constituents minus hemicellulose. We commonly use this to calculate energy in the forage sample. So when I calculate total digestible nutrients, that will be based off of acid detergent fiber. And that's why I'm showing you this. So if we look at the average, again, alfalfa and alfalfa grass mixtures are going to tend to be lower, and legumes will tend to be lower overall, but not as low as NDF. And then we've got our average 40% NDF for these thousands of samples that we analyzed in this data set. Now it's really important to remember that we again can get high values of ADF also, which means that they're going to be less digestible. Generally speaking, when we're talking about fiber, higher levels of fiber are not good in the animal. let's move on to total digestible nutrients. So I said earlier that when we balance a ration, we balance for two things in most cases, and that's crude protein concentration and total digestible nutrients or energy in that ration. And down here on the table is the energy requirements of different classes of beef cattle. So for example, a dry cow would only need 50% total digestible nutrients to maintain body condition, but a lactating brood cow would need about 20% more or 60% total digestible nutrients to maintain her body condition score. So the average for this sample, if we look at total digestible nutrients, and again, total digestible nutrients represents the amount of that sample that can be digested by the animal. And it's going to be higher, as you would expect, for alfalfa and alfalfa grass mixtures, and the higher the value, the better. Grasses are right in the mid-50s for total digestible nutrients. And remember, just like any other forage sample, they can be either very good, this maximum value in the 60 to 70%, or it can be pretty bad. If it's mature and has gotten rained on, the total digestible nutrients are going to tend to be less. So to kind of summarize things, I want to talk just a little bit about the percentage of samples meeting the energy requirements of various animal classes. And we're going to focus in on grass and grass clover mixtures for this particular data set. So when we start here at the bottom, we look at a dry cow mid-gestation. So that's going to be the lowest nutrient requirement. 80% of the hay samples in this large data set that we analyzed from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture for grass and grass clover samples are going to meet the nutrient requirement, the energy requirements for that cow in mid-gestation. That quickly drops to around 40% for a cow in late gestation. So as that cow's nearing calving, her nutrient requirements are going to start to ramp up. So 40% of the samples. When we get to a lactating cow, so that's a cow that's had a calf, she's actively lactating, and that's when her energy requirement is going to be the highest. Only 12% of those samples will meet her requirements. Think about it, that's about 1 out of every 10 samples, hay samples, will meet the requirements of a lactating cow. It's important to know what your forage quality is because this is really a critical period during the production cycle for a beef cow, and we need to make sure we supplement them accordingly so that they don't lose condition during lactation. And then when we talk about this last class, and that's growing animals, it's going to be very difficult to meet their nutrient requirements and have a reasonable rate of gain with just grass hay. The last graph I want to show you is kind of just my categories for hay, and I kind of based them off of total digestible nutrients. I've got really bad to really good hay samples. And I made this graph because I wanted to tell you that I don't expect to move everyone from really bad hay to really good hay. That's not even a reasonable expectation. But look, if I can just move you from really bad hay to bad hay, or maybe really bad hay to okay hay by just a few simple things that you learned tonight, then we've really done something. And that should be your goal. If I can move you to that okay hay, we're going to limit the amount of supplementation we need. That's going to cut our supplementation costs significantly. And it's going to leave our animals in better condition coming out of winter. And that's super important in a cow-calf operation because body condition score is so closely related to reproductive efficiency in beef cattle herds. Last thing I want to mention is that whether you're buying or selling hay, knowing the weight of a hay bale is really important. It's going to allow you to plan. It's going to allow you to offer your hay for a reasonable price. And it's also going to allow you to buy hay and make sure that you're getting a decent deal when you buy that hay. It's also going to let you determine the needs. We can count bales. It's much harder to estimate the weight of the bale if we haven't weighed a few. So if we know the weight, we can count the number of bales and make sure that we've got enough hay for the winter. It's also going to let us determine or roughly determine intake. So if we know how much a bale weighs and how many days it's taking to eat that bale, then we can get an idea of how much those animals are eating. And we can also use it to determine feeding losses, depending on our feeding system. All right, that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions or entertain any discussion that you all might have.
All right. Thanks for bringing us back on, Becky, and be happy to answer any questions. The way we're going to handle questions tonight is if you have a question, please type it in the chat box, and then we have several people that will be monitoring the chat and will ask the questions. Do we currently have any questions in the chat box?
Not currently, Chris. I'm watching.
I must have done a really good job tonight. So we'll wait just a couple seconds, and if we don't see any questions, then we'll move on to our next speaker.
To be quiet. So, let's see. How can I do a few steps to make my hay better? That's from Mohammed Adebi. Excuse me.
I think there's some key principles that we're going to learn tonight to improve forage quality, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag right now. Dr. Henning, our last speaker on the program today, is going to be talking about practical approaches to improving hay quality. And he's going to address some of those very practical things that we can do to move from that really bad hay to maybe okay hay. And then we have Dennis Hancock that's going to talk about using baleage too on the program. So I think I'll leave that question to a little bit later in the program.
And we've got another one. Is there an easy way to weigh hay?
That's a great question. A lot of times the weight of the bale doesn't correspond real well to what's in the owner's manual for the baler. So it's important to weigh some hay. You don't have to weigh every bale, but if you could put some bales on a trailer and run over a scale at a quarry or a truck stop or the feed mill and just get an idea of what those bales are weighing, that's going to probably be your best choice to weigh that bale.
Jimmy, we have some other ones in the Q&A section. Chris, what is the price for a hay sample?
So the cost of a hay sample at Kentucky Department of Agriculture is $10, and that's subsidized. Most commercial labs are going to be paying somewhere between $15 and $20 for a standard hay sample analyzed by near-infrared spectroscopy. So we're probably looking somewhere in the range of $15 to $20 for a commercial hay sample.
Okay, there's another question here. Is it possible to even feed steers enough forage to not require supplementation?
That's a better question for Dr. Lemcoer in the next session, but I would say it's going to be difficult to get enough energy in those animals. You can probably meet their crude protein requirements with good quality forage, but it's probably going to be pushing to get enough energy in those animals.
Okay. Are there studies that have analyzed forage quality over the last few decades?
I don't know if there's any replicated studies that have done that. I'm sure there's large data sets from commercial labs. And again, the problem with data sets from commercial labs is they will tend to be skewed towards better quality hay samples in most cases. The worst quality hay is the hay that nobody's testing. It's that hay when we look in April and it's has sprouted like a chia pet. That's going to be hay that's was too mature when it was harvested. So, and it's hard to get those samples from a lab because those producers are not submitting samples to labs in most cases.
How would you approach Lespedeza in a hay pasture?
Lespedeza is not necessarily a bad forage crop if it's managed well. It's the most difficult part of Lespedeza, and I'm assuming they're talking about Sericea lespedeza, which is the a warm season perennial forage. The most difficult part about curing that is hay is getting the stems dry enough to put into a bale without the leaves getting too brittle and falling off. So it's a similar problem to alfalfa. You have to be very careful how you handle that plant once those leaves get dry and brittle. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's several more here, Chris. Could you repeat the minimum crude protein and minimum CDP for lacting cows?
The minimum crude protein for a lactating cow would be somewhere in that range of 10 to 12%. I think our next speaker, Jeff Lemcoer, will cover that in much greater detail. And the minimum energy requirements for a lactating brood cow would be around 60% total digestible nutrients. And only 12% of the grass and grass clover hay samples in that large data set from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture would meet the energy requirements of a lactating cow.
How much quality is lost on hay stored inside?
Once that hay is properly cured and then it's stored off the ground, out of the weather, there's minimal storage losses inside. The largest storage losses will come from hay that's stored outside. And those storage losses could range anywhere from 15 to 30%, depending on the conditions that they're stored under and the environmental conditions. So I saw that last question pop up there, and I'll just mention, Carrie, it was about what's the forage quality change going to be from harvest to feeding. The ideal scenario is that you would harvest closer to actually feeding that forage, and that's going to give you a better idea of the quality of that forage. If I harvest in the field and then I store those bales in a tree line for 6 months, where they never dry out and they get rained on outside, the quality deterioration can be quite high and the dry matter losses can be quite high in those bales. So it's going to depend a little bit on storage conditions, how much change there is from harvest to feeding. All right. Is there any other questions? We'll take one more and then we'll probably need to move on.
Chris, Carrie Brown said she'd like to answer one of the questions live. It's from Jonathan Tompkins. It says, as a new farmer, what can I do to improve my mixed grass fields?
Okay.
That's for Chris. It's just noting that it needs to be answered live.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my bad.
That's okay.
So how would you improve your mixed grass fields?
Okay. So there's several things you can do, but it really starts with soil testing. So if I'm starting and I've got a mixed grass hay stand that I want to improve, the first thing I'm going to do is, well, I'll assess it and then I'll get a soil test. And then if it needs lime and fertilizer, it'll get lime and fertilizer. That's very important. You can't have a sustainable hay program if you don't have a good soil fertility program. And it's important to remember every time we cut hay off of whether it's a pasture or a hay field, we're removing nutrients. We remove somewhere in that range of 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton. In a bale of hay, we remove about 15 pounds of phosphorus as phosphate, and we remove somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds of potash. And if we're not replacing those nutrients, we can very quickly draw nutrient levels down in that hayfield and pasture. So it's essential that when we start out, we get an idea of what our soil fertility is. And then if it's a mixed grass stand and we want to improve it, we can control our weeds in that pasture. Once we have our weeds under control, we can come in and we can overseed that stand with some red clover and ladino clover, and that will bring nitrogen into that system and also improve forage quality, which is very important role of clover in those hay stands. So those are some basic things that you could do to help improve forage quality of those stands. And Jimmy will talk more about that later on this evening. All right, I think we need to move on so we can stay on schedule tonight. I know Dr. Lacefield is in the audience. I don't want to get too far behind. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off, and Becky's going to play another introductory video for us.
Kentucky's young producers are our future. More than financing, Central Kentucky Ag Credit knows and understands that supporting their passion is vital to sustaining the agricultural industry. Our support for young, beginning, and small farmers is enhanced by our relationship-centered lending philosophy. Central Kentucky Ag Credit is here to serve Central Kentucky's farmers.
Give your cattle a healthy start and keep them healthy with biomass. Find out how Alltech can help you protect your cattle and your legacy. Find out more at biomass.com.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be back with you. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him a short one anyways. It's Dr. Jeff Lemcoer, and it's been a pleasure working with Jeff since I came back to Kentucky in 2017. Jeff was a master grazer coordinator, and he's turned those duties over to me, and I appreciate that, Jeff. And he received his BS from Purdue University and completed his graduate studies at the University of Missouri. Jeff's first position was in Wisconsin as a beef specialist there in Wisconsin before he came back to Kentucky in 2008. His responsibilities include providing producers with science-based practical information, allowing them to make more informed decisions. And that's exactly what he's going to do tonight in tonight's presentation. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeff Lemcoer, who's going to be talking to us about what to do with the hay test once you've got it.
Hello, I'm Jeff Lemcoer, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and I want to thank the Planning Committee for asking me to share with you a little bit about you got a forage test and now what. And so we'll spend a little bit of time here going through what we can do with a forage test. Before we get into that, I want to just mention that when we think about our feeding program, it really is a balancing act. As we look at a seesaw or a teeter-totter here example, we've got nutrient supply on the left-hand side, and that's going to be involving nutrient concentration or how much is in a feedstuff, the digestibility of the feedstuff to release those nutrients, and then obviously intake level of a given feed. And then on the right-hand side, kind of balancing out the teeter-totter or the seesaw, here's the nutrient requirements of the animals themselves. Think about the net energy system for beef cows. We have maintenance requirement needs to support current tissue body mass and normal body functions for the animal. We have then conceptus growth, which would be kind of the requirements for reproduction. And then obviously if the cow's lactating, the more milk she's producing, the more energy and protein is going to be required to support that level of milk production. We haven't talked about game. We're going to predominantly focus on beef cows today, but obviously we wanted to think about growing calves in, we wouldn't be dealing with reproduction and lactation. We would be looking at tissue accretion and the differences between a calf gaining 1 pound versus maybe a calf gaining 2 or 3 pounds per day. So when we want to start this process of thinking about looking at this balancing act in the feeding program, one of the first places to start is to estimate the nutrient supply. And nutrient supply is going to involve, obviously, intake, as we already discussed, nutrient concentration, and that's going to be determined by a forage test, and then the digestibility of a feedstuff, and then absorption of those nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract. Our forage test provides us with that level of nutrient concentration like we already discussed, and in some instances we may get predictions for digestibility of certain components within the feed, and particularly when we're looking at the fiber component to give us an idea how much energy we may get out of a forage. But when we're trying to estimate intake, we can get some components from a forage test that can be useful to help us predict what intake of a given forage may be, particularly looking at different qualities, low versus high quality forages. And the first and kind of the easiest approach would be to use neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. Some of the forage tests may list them as ANDF, and A just stands for amylase, so that there's no starch contaminating the cell wall components. And that equation then is dry matter intake as a percent of body weight equal to a constant factor of 120 divided by the NDF value within the given forage that we might be looking at. And so here's an example. If we run through the equation here using a hay that had a NDF value of 62, 120 divided by 62 gives us 1.9%. And so we take that a little further on a 1,300 pound cow. We take 1.9% and convert it back to the decimal form by dividing by 100. We come up with an estimated forage intake of 25 pounds of dry matter. So net energy for maintenance can be used to estimate intake for pregnant dry cows, and this is what NASEM uses. And here's the equation. You can see the net energy for maintenance in megacows per day is given by this equation here. All these units are in metric, so if you try to use this for yourself, be sure to convert body weight to kilograms, and then most of your forage test values are going to have megacows per pound, and you'll have to convert that to megacows per kilogram. And if we go through an example with a 1,300 pound cow with a hay that had a 58% TDN, we go through that first process of converting body weight into metabolic body weight and following through the known concentration of NEM for the hay. We come up with a net energy for maintenance intake prediction of 14.6 megacows per day. Now that doesn't do us a lot of good, and we need to convert that back out into meaningful information for you, which would be pounds per day. And so in this example, the hay would contain 1.23 megacows per kilogram. And so when we divide 14.6 megacows by the concentration of energy, which is 1.23 megacows per kilogram, that gives us an estimate of 11.9 kilograms, or multiply that by 2.2 to come up with 26 pounds per day. Very close. And one thing to keep in the back of our mind is that the net energy for prediction equation here is for cows that are pregnant and dry. And the NASEM does say that for lactating cows, we would need to make an increase based on the level of milk production for intake. And so we won't go through that for a time today, but just realize that this is kind of the baseline prediction. Now, there are some things to keep in the back of our mind for intake and trying to estimate what that might be. And even with the wealth of knowledge that we have today, we figure that we can account for about 70% of the variation in intake. So there are factors that we have to consider, such as anti-nutritional factors like alkaloids, and one of our common ones that we would be familiar with would be the ergot alkaloids. But there are other alkaloids in other forages that can have a detrimental impact on intake. We have the potential for mold and mycotoxins to have a reduction on forage intake. And then one we don't often think about is actually nutrient deficiencies. And in this example I'm using is degradable intake protein. And so if we have a shortage of degradable intake protein, the microbes won't be as productive, and they won't be able to replicate as quickly and break down forages in the rumen as fast, and that will have a detrimental impact on forage intake. And then lastly, environment. One of the things we have to keep in the back of our mind is that really muddy conditions can limit the desire for cattle to move freely towards feed, and particularly if we're dealing with muddy hay rings in the wintertime, that the environment itself can play a negative role on forage intake. So given these factors, if you're considering looking at nutrient requirement tables that we're going to talk about here in a minute to try and estimate forage intake, take a little bit of time to actually visually inspect the forage and see how mature the forage may be. Is it stemmy? Is there seed heads in it? And so in this particular example, you can see this hay sample's got quite a few stems in it. There's some foxtail seed heads in here that would give us an indication that this was cut in late summer. But the stem to leaf ratio here is quite high for stems and not so high for leaves, which would give us an indication of a relatively mature forage that's going to have lower digestibility. Are there weeds present? And an example would be like ironweed that's not going to be very palatable, and so they may reduce intake of that. And if you're trying to force them to eat that, then that's going to have a detrimental impact on voluntary intake as well. Is there mold present, and does it have a kind of a musty smell to it that may have a detrimental impact on intake? All these things you can do real quickly by just pulling out some hay and looking at it and getting a rough idea of whether or not you may need to make some adjustments on intake predictions from the nutrient requirement tables that we're going to talk about. NASEM that I referred to earlier stands for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They publish the current nutrient requirements of beef cattle publication. Formerly, it was the National Research Council, and we've referred to it as the NRC. But basically, committees go through the scientific literature and then make recommendations for nutrient requirement levels for beef cattle. And this publication is the basis for developing feed programs. Nutritionists may refer to it as the Nutritionist Bible, because it really is the foundation of developing feeding programs. But then as a nutritionist, we often have to take the recommendations to fit different scenarios and different management situations that we may be dealing with, and make slight adjustments here and there based on what we see in the field. And I just wanted to share with you some nutrient requirement tables and what they may look like. And you can find these by doing a Google search on the internet. Oftentimes there are extension publications that are accessible. You can also run computer models to generate nutrient requirement tables. And most of the tables are going to be based on the stage of production. And so this is an example table here. We have a 1,300 pound mature cow weight with a peak estimate of 20 pounds of milk. As is the case with most of these tables, on the left-hand side, you're going to have month since calving for our cow tables anyways. You're going to have month since calving. In this example, we're going 1 through 6 months. And it's going to reflect the differences in milk production. Most of our beef cows will peak out somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks, and the NASEM model assumes 8.5 weeks for milk production. So here what we're saying is that within the second month since calving, cows are going to reach peak, and they're going to have that peak at 20 pounds, which is indicated here in the table. Now, another column, we have body weight, and so you can see that body weight remains constant for the first 2 months, and then it begins to increase as the conceptus or the fetus begins to grow, and you've got more tissue there for the reproductive tract. Dry matter intake is often given in these tables, and this is important, particularly given the discussion we had earlier about making adjustments based on anti-nutritional factors such as mold and alkaloids that may be present. These tables are giving you assumed values for nutrient requirements based off of these assumed intakes. It's particularly important to understand that with 16 pounds of TDN required at 28 pounds of dry matter intake, if a cow is only consuming 20 pounds of dry matter, then they still have to achieve close to 16 pounds of TDN. The concentration of energy will be higher, or will need to be higher in that forage. So as you move down the lactation curve, you can see that the energy and crude protein values for requirements tend to follow the level of milk production. Now, I just want to reiterate that livestock have nutrient requirements based on quantities. In other words, in this table, we're showing pounds per day. They don't go out and consume percentages. We talk about percentages often because it's easier when we're talking about a forage test that has crude protein or TDN listed as a percentage. But understand and appreciate that those percentages are going to be based off of the dry matter intake assumed and meeting the actual quantity of nutrient needed. A few cautions about using the published tables that you may find on the internet is that most don't account for breed differences, and NASEM recommendations do give some discussion in there about making adjustments for breeds. The maintenance requirement, for example, will differ by breeds, where Bos indicus influenced livestock will have a lower maintenance requirement than our continental and British cattle. And so in this example, I'm just showing you that Brayfords would have about a 5% less or 5% lower maintenance requirement than Angus. Then also, there's going to be differences for breeds based on their genetic potential for milk production. And so the NASEM table has Simmental cattle in at a peak milk production of 26 pounds on average, compared to Angus, who have a peak production of only 18. And so again, as you understand, milk production increases the nutrient needs. If we have two different breeds, it's important to understand that the models themselves that are generating these tables are taking into account the genetic differences that may have been in there 20 years ago. And so the genetic trend for breeds needs to make or be considered when making some adjustment to the nutrient requirements for livestock. But the tables themselves are using these types of values as an example to generate the nutrient requirements in those tables. Now, also, many of the tables are only going to give you nutrients based on a percentage concentration. In other words, 10% crude protein, 54% TDN, and not give you the pounds of TDN or the pounds of protein or the grams of or milligrams of a mineral. I mentioned this already, but it's really important to reiterate. These are based on assumed dry matter intakes, and so you have to understand or appreciate that your concentrations may be higher or lower depending on what type of forage intake you may be getting. And this is our biggest challenge, is not knowing exactly what intakes are going to be on given farms. And so we really are approaching it with best guesstimates. And then lastly, there's the assumption that there's no environmental stress, no cold stress, no heat stress. We're not dealing with wet hides and mud, and we're not dealing with 95-degree temperatures and 60% relative humidities. The tables generate the nutrient requirements at thermal neutral conditions. Now, the third step is trying to take and look at the balance between the forage nutrient supplies and the animal nutrient requirements, and evaluate different feeding programs. And we utilize forage test values to get the nutrient concentrations, and we can plug those into a tool like this, which is the UK Beef Cow Forage Supplement tool. And we would use our forage test information to enter in these values. And then we would try to predict the intake, like we talked about, using maybe NDF or the net energy concentration of the forage, and then balance out the ration. And so I'm going to go through as a quick example of what a forage test may look like. This is from a stockpile of grass out of the Little Research Farm this fall. And so when we look at these values, it's important to kind of keep in the back of our mind that the nutrient requirements for cattle are based on a dry matter basis. And so if we want to use a table of nutrient requirements and compare a forage and how well the forage matches up to the requirements, we want to use dry matter values, not as received or as fed values, because the moisture is diluting down the concentration of the nutrients. It's also important to understand that we're not making adjustments in these values for digestibility. These are actual just concentration values within a feedstuff. And so we can do a really quick evaluation of forages and whether or not they're going to meet the nutrient requirements of cattle at different stages of production by comparing our forage test results, and here's our forage test again that I brought over from the last page of 60.8 TDN, 11.6% crude protein. And here's a different nutrient requirement table for a mature cow with a peak weight of 1,300 pounds and a peak of milk, or a peak milk production of 25 pounds. And they've broken it down in the stage of production: early lactation, mid-lactation, mid-gestation, and late gestation, as well as giving you the corresponding months since calving. And so if we quickly want to see how this forage does, we can see that, we're going to be short on energy here in the second and third month post-calving when milk production is at its highest. And so we're going to be short in calories or energy because the TDN value is lower than what that requirement is at these 2 months. However, that forage would be sufficient for mid and late lactation. It would be fine for mid and late gestation as well. And in all reality, this forage would basically meet the protein requirements, and so protein supplementation would not necessarily be needed if this was the forage that we had available to us. And so really we would be looking at maybe energy supplementation during the second and third month post-calving if we were dealing maybe with fall calving cows and we're having to feed this hay. And then lastly, step 4 is to develop a supplement strategy. And our primary goal in a supplement program should be to meet the nutritional requirements to achieve that level of production that's desired in the operation. And then secondly, we want to do that the most cost effectively. It is not the other way around where we feed the cows as cheap as we possibly can and hope that we meet the nutritional needs. Primary goal is to meet the nutritional needs as cost effectively as possible. And when we're designing supplement programs, we want to consider the cost and then also how are we going to be able to handle and deliver the feedstuffs. Some of us may be set up to be able to handle liquid feeds like stillage and syrup, but the rest of us may not be able to, and we may need to use buckets like the photo shows and feed the cows maybe every day or even every other day or twice a week. And so we can develop strategic supplement programs. And there's an approach as an example. Let's assume that the forage supplies 12.5 megacals of energy a day. We've taken the nutrient concentration, got an estimate of intake, and this is what we come up with a supply. We looked up in a nutrient requirement table and found out that the cows actually required 14 megacals per day, so we're deficient 1.5 megacals. We could use a feedstuff table and look up different feeds and supplements that we may be able to purchase, and so in this example we'll assume we're going to use soybean hulls, and they have a concentration of 0.82 megacals per pound of dry matter. In order to determine how much soy hulls is needed, it's very simple. We take the deficiency of 1.5 megacals and divide it by the concentration of energy in the supplement, and soy hulls in this example is 0.82, and so we end up coming up and finding out that we need 1.8 pounds of soy hulls on a dry matter basis, and we know that soy hulls have about 10% moisture, so we correct that to determine the as fed by dividing by 0.9 or 90% dry matter to come up with 2 pounds of soy hulls needed per day to provide that 1.5 megacals of energy to overcome that deficiency. And so computer programs today are how most of us are going to take and approach this. But for something very simple like this, using the tables, we can really quickly come up with some rough estimates on what the nutritional supplement program may need to be. And then lastly, I just want to say that forage testing really is a key on really balancing this forage supply versus nutrient needs. And the test provides us really with that foundational information because it gives us an idea to be able to predict what the nutrient supply is going to be. And it's important that we understand that we want to just not look at crude protein, and I've plotted crude protein and TDN for about 400 forage samples taken this year from the Eastern Kentucky Hay Contest. And what I did is for a given level at 7.8% crude protein here, I've looked at the energy values from the lowest value at 48.8% TDN to the highest value, which was 57.7% TDN. In other words, these forages contained the exact same amount of crude protein, but yet drastically different energy values. And so often we think about the best feed has the highest crude protein, but there is significant variation in energy content of forages at the same crude protein level. So go beyond looking at crude protein and particularly pay attention to your energy content of your forages. And then lastly, the old saying is still true that the eye of the master fattens the beast. And so be sure to monitor your cows for body condition score and make adjustments to your supplement and feeding programs to maintain the desired body condition to optimize the performance that you want to see in your cows. With that, I want to thank you, and I hope we touched on a few things that might be useful for you this evening, and provide you with some general information on why you would want to forage test and how we can use that forage test to develop strategic supplement programs to optimize your production on your farm, and do that while meeting the nutritional requirements of the cows as cost effectively as we can. For more information, feel free to contact your county extension office and talk to your ag agent, or you can reach me at the email address there, or you can call and leave a message on my phone if I'm out of the office. Thank you again. If you have questions, feel free to reach out.
All right, Jeff, thank you for that outstanding presentation. Just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, make sure and type that question into the chat box. Do we have a few questions for Jeff?
We had a person ask, Jeff, where might they find these tables, or could you give them a place to look?
That's a great question. And as I indicated, if you use a web search tool like Google or Firefox, any of those, and if you type in nutrient requirements for beef cattle extension, you're going to get several extension hits, and one may be from Oklahoma State, Arkansas, Mississippi State, et cetera. So I would advise you to go and just type that into your search engine and look for the ones that the extension has developed.
Got another question that says, my cows look really fat and they don't stop eating. Do you know what's wrong?
Well, that is a bit of a challenge. And so when we think about it, oftentimes we will see heavier conditioned cows in our fall calving herd, mainly because if you look at those nutrient requirements as we go into cows that have been weaned and are not lactating, they have the lowest time of nutritional requirements immediately following that weaning time, 6 to 8 months. And so in fall calving cows, that tends to correspond when our grass is pretty productive in that May-June time frame, and they're able to take advantage of those extra energy and protein values coming in from that forage and actually put condition back on. So you may have to think about, you got either A, too good a hay, which rarely happens, or too good a forage. And it could be that you're dealing with that fall calving situation. And lastly, it could be too that just not enough milk production. And you have a situation where your forage resources are better than the average, and you may need to think about breeding a little more milk into the cow herd.
And we've got a couple more. So Chris, you let me know when the time is out. But how long should you wait after putting up the hay to get a hay test?
So I think Dr. Teutsch hit on that a little bit. And, you know, his comment was the closer to the time that you're going to feed it. And my feeling is a little bit opposite on that. And mainly from a management standpoint, I would like to have it while it's still in the field before you bury that hay that you need for a lactating cow all the way in the back and you can't get to it. And I'm being a little bit facetious there, but a lot of times what happens is we move in and we have our lowest quality hay is usually or often our first cutting hay because it's later cut due to spring rain and that, and it gets buried in the back of the barn. And for spring calving herds, we typically want to feed the worst quality hay first. And so if I've got second and third cutting that's better stacked in front of that first cutting, it's backwards of where I need to be. But now if I'm dealing with fall calving herds, it works just fine because I need to feed my best quality hay first because they're coming off of peak or near peak lactation. So I tend to say, you know, I agree with Dr. Teutsch. It's best to do as close as feeding as possible, but when planning and managing, try to make sure you stage your hay to get access to it based on when these cows are calving.
And one more, what was the tool used to determine balance, excess, and deficit? It was shown in step 3, they thought.
So again, that's a tool that Kevin Laurent took lead effort on developing. Dr. Burris and myself helped him develop that. That is the, if you Google the UK beef forage tool in Google or Firefox, it'll be one of the first web applications that will pop up. So it's just the University of Kentucky's beef forage supplement tool.
Okay, I think that has got us caught up right now.
Thank you all, and I'll be on again for the rest of the program.
Thank you, Jeff, for that outstanding presentation. And we're going to move on to our next speaker. And before
wait, Chris, wait, can we have a word from our sponsors?
Yeah, before we introduce Dennis, we're going to go ahead and have a word from our sponsors. Thank you, Becky.
H&R AgriPower, Kentucky's premier Case IH dealer, has the power to get you more. More productivity with new and used equipment from Case IH and other manufacturers. More precision farming solutions to help you maximize your yield. More parts with the area's largest inventory so you get the parts you need fast. More service, whether on the farm or in our shop. H&R Superior Service keeps your equipment running strong. Supporting farmers in Kentucky agriculture with the power to get you more. H&R AgriPower.
For almost 70 years, families have relied on Bush Hog's legendary performance. Whether you cut roadside ditches, tall grasses, row crops, or the front yard, they deliver. They offer residential and commercial ZT mowers with a host of cutting-edge features. Their products transform your property into a land of opportunity. And like all good relationships, they're here for the long haul. If it doesn't say Bush Hog, it just won't cut it. See your local dealer today.
All right, we're back. Thanks, Becky. And I do want to thank Becky for organizing this evening and putting all the videos together and the sponsorship and so forth. She's done a great job, and she's even printed us out a script so we can stay on time. And I'm doing a poor job at following it, unfortunately. My pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and our next speaker is Dr. Dennis Hancock. And Dr. Hancock is currently has started as the director at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Dennis is a Kentucky native. He's actually from Western Kentucky. He grew up on a 100-acre cow-calf operation in Western Kentucky. His father also ran a gravel, lime, and fertilizer spreading business. Dennis went to Berea College for his undergraduate, and then Dennis and I were in graduate school together at the University of Kentucky in Forages, and we actually had the same advisor. So it's really a pleasure to see Dennis back. Before, Dennis was director at the Dairy Forage Research Center in Madison, Wisconsin. He was probably one of the top forage extension specialists in the United States, and he developed a nationally known forage extension program at the University of Georgia. So we're very happy to have Dennis with us tonight, and he is going to talk about practical considerations for making high quality baleage. Dennis, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you all very much for having me, and I think Becky has the video queued up, so we'll listen in and see you in a few minutes. Hello, my name is Dennis Hancock. I get to be the Center Director for the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center up in Madison, Wisconsin. And I was asked to talk today about practical considerations for making high quality baleage. Let's start with just a brief review about silage. Silage is nothing more really than the pickling process of taking forage and fermenting the sugars that are inside of it into an acid. And those organic acids actually inhibit the growth of fungi. Now this must occur in anaerobic conditions. There cannot be any oxygen getting in here, or else that allows the fungi to get an unfair advantage. So if it is an anaerobic situation, we get this pH drop, and a low pH actually reduces the enzymatic activity of some of the undesirable species, including some of the bacterial species like the Clostridium bacteria that actually end up causing botulism, which we'll talk about later on. Now, silage has been in use since 1500 BC. There's evidence from sources about Egypt and Carthage that it was actively being done 1500 years before the Common Era. So why choose baleage over hay? Well, one of the main reasons for that, of course, is weather-related issues. If we think about the common factor there of the weatherman getting the forecast wrong whenever we fire up the hay mower, we constantly are running into situations where rain damage is a real threat. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. And I'm going to pick some data from my master's research, actually, from back in the late 1990s. And this was a study that ended up getting published in 2006, where we looked at, in this case, the fiber components, the NDF, the neutral detergent fiber. And here we want that number to be low. Okay, we want a lower number here. Lower number of NDF is higher quality. So if we look at pre-storage, before we actually ever stored it, you can see that those values for hay and silage are fairly similar, but notice that this storage loss that occurred here in trial 1. Now, if we look at trial 2 in a very similar situation, except for we got rain damage on our hay. And then we also had some storage loss that was associated with hay being stored too. So what is really happening here with baleage is it's helping to reduce the risk of rain and storage losses. So in addition to this, silage has many benefits. Beyond just the rain damage aspect and the storage loss aspect, it enables us to be more timely in our harvest. So we can fit in a 1 or 2 day window for harvesting our forages a lot easier than we can a 4 or 5 day drying window that sometimes never develops. So it also allows for less shatter loss. So if it's harvested wet, we don't lose as many leaves. And that's where the quality really is. So we end up with much higher quality, lower fiber levels, higher protein levels, increased digestibility, and increased palatability. The cattle and the animals that are consuming it generally like it a lot better. But silage does have a few risks. One of those is the expense of the equipment, the labor, and plastic. And that's usually pretty expensive for most operators. So it's really unlikely to be economical for smaller herds. The other thing about the plastic is that recycling is not really practical nor economical. So that is one area of loss, and that's a real challenge in the system. The other thing to remember is we put garbage into that plastic container, we're going to get garbage right back out. There is nothing magical about silage. It's not going to take good stuff and turn it in, or bad stuff and turn it into good. But it can take good stuff and turn it into bad if we're not really careful about what we're doing. One major aspect of this is moisture management, and moisture targets are still pretty challenging to hit consistently, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. If we go too wet, then we really run the risk of a secondary fermentation and botulism poisoning. Conversely, if we go too dry, we don't get the fermentation that we really want, and that product is not nearly as stable. It may be a lot more moldy. So here is an exaggerated version of Baleage bale here, and inside of that Baleage, inside of that forage are sugars. So what's happening in this situation is these lactic acid forming bacteria, these are LAB, or lactic acid forming bacteria, are acting on those sugars, and in the absence of oxygen, here along this side here, we have all of this is being excluded, all of this oxygen is being excluded from the system. We have a plastic layer here in the case of Baleage that's keeping that oxygen out of the system. So in the absence of that oxygen, those sugars are converted over into lactic acid. Lactic acid forming bacteria, no surprise, they form lactic acid. And that's the principal component of what we're looking at here. And that's really what we want. We want more and more lactic acid as much as we can get. Now, there are some heterofermentative bacteria, not the LAB, but some heterofermentative bacteria that can form some lactic acid, but they also form things like acetic acid, things that kind of give it a vinegary smell. And then other side products here too, propionic acid, carbon dioxide, which is a major source of dry matter loss. Sometimes we can get a little ethanol production there. And then here is one of our biggest concerns is butyric acid. And I'll talk more about that, but we want those butyric acids to be as low as possible and the lactic acid levels to be as high as possible. So with that pH, with that acid forming, we get a pH drop that comes along. So within just a few days, we start seeing a pH drop, and those heterofermentative bacteria start kind of falling by the wayside as the lactic acid forming bacteria end up taking over. And eventually that pH can be driven down into the low 4s. In some cases, like in corn silage, we may be down in the 3s in terms of pH. Now this is more typical for a grass curve. If we look at legumes, generally speaking, they are more buffered against a pH change, meaning they don't change as readily or as easily. So they may never really get below about 4.7. But in any case, we want to make sure we're getting below 5. That's really our target. We want that to be our pH at least below 5. Now, when we talk about Baleage and compare that, for example, against chopped silage. So here in Madison at our research dairy, we make chopped alfalfa silage, and we put those in bunkers or in ag bags or something like that. And generally that pH drop is really, really rapid. However, with Baleage, we don't get that rapid pH drop, nor does it go nearly as far down. So it's not uncommon at all for us to be in the low 5s rather than below 5. We really want to be down below 5 though. That's the goal. And again, if we look at the comparison between Baleage in the yellow here and chopped silage in the green, you can see that early on there's a difference, and throughout, at the end of this fermentation, the chopped silage is a lot more thoroughly fermented, not only in terms of lactic acid, but also in terms of total fermentation acids. So you're getting a more thorough fermentation in chopped silage than you are in Baleage. Now, that still can be a sufficient amount of acid for it to be really good and stable. So that does not mean that Baleage, is not a good silage. It can still be really good feed. It's just that it's not as thorough a fermentation, and therefore it can be a little bit riskier. So Baleage is easier to deal with, uses a lot of the same equipment as we use in haymaking. It's more portable to a degree even. And for
in most cases, it's going to be more cost effective for those medium scale producers. Fermentation is not necessarily as rapid nor as complete, and so that pH drop never really reaches the ideal levels that we would see in chop silage. In chop silage, it can go into the bunk a lot faster, especially if we're using scale appropriate equipment, but it does use that specialized equipment that can be a lot more expensive, and it needs to be stored near the feeding area, wherever we're going to be using it. Now, if we think about the cost effectiveness of something like this, it's really only going to be appropriate for the larger scale producers. Fermentation is going to be a lot more rapid and more thorough, and that pH drop is going to be much more ideal. But if we're going to make baleage, we really need to pay attention to the details. The details. Now, you don't have to be really good at spelling, but you really have to pay attention to the details. So the first detail is no rain damage. We don't want to be putting up baleage that has been rained on. It does the same thing to baleage as it does to grass hay or hay that we're trying to dry down, is it's going to leach out some of the soluble carbohydrates, and therefore it's going to reduce the sugars that are available for fermentation. The other thing we need to do is to plan ahead. We need to be able to wrap and bale, or bale and wrap in that order, within 12 hours. So we need to make sure we don't cut down any more than we can the next day or whenever we get ready to bale it all and wrap it all within 12 hours. We need to maximize the bale size, but we need to account for the fact that those bales of the same size are going to be about twice as heavy as an equivalent size hay bale. We also need to be making really good dense bales. The denser it is, the better the fermentation will be. We also want to use a baler with a pre-cut system if possible. That way, if we are using it in a mixed ration, it's a lot easier to process that way. If you're just feeding a bale at a time, there's nothing wrong with that at all. In that case, a pre-cutter may not necessarily be all that advantageous. Now, I also advocate the use of net wraps. Net wrap actually can speed up field efficiency, but it also helps to lay down the stem so you don't get as many holes poking through the plastic as you're getting ready to wrap it. The next detail is to choose a site that's really appropriate for wrapping. In many cases, it needs to be near the feeding area. That's really the ideal so that you don't have to handle it or risk damage to it. You want to ensure that the site that you select poses a low risk of damage. What do I mean by that? Well, I want a site that has a good sod to it, doesn't have a lot of weeds around it that are going to potentially poke a hole through the plastic or provide a habitat for rodents or something like that that other animals may be chasing around. Coyotes are really bad about chasing those rodents, and they might jump on top of the plastic bales and start rolling around on it. And that's a very common problem is coyotes or dogs or other things that are chasing things through the storage area can do some damage there. It's also important, I think, to locate it at least about 12 feet from a fence line. This is important so that one can minimize the bird traffic. So birds have a tendency to light on top of the bales, and they want to pick at the bale. Sometimes they'll try to see something underneath there that they'll pick at, and that can introduce holes. The other thing you want to do is regularly observe those areas to see if there's any damage that wildlife or vandals have caused. And if there is any damage, to go ahead and tape those holes using a UV treated tape. Greenhouse tape or baleage tape is absolutely crucial there. So apply the plastic appropriately as well. That's another detail. 6+ layers on individual bales is really ideal. 8+ layers on inline bales is ideal. And it's also important to use end caps and to tape any holes. Now, I know there are a lot of producers that will just leave that end bale open and they won't wrap it. That bale is going to deteriorate. It's not going to be worth feeding, or if you do feed it, it could cause some injury or death. So it's highly advised to use an end cap. At $20 or wherever it costs to use an end cap, is money well spent in most cases. Now ensure that the wrap is being routed through the stretch rollers appropriately. Make sure that that tacky side is toward the bale. And you also want to clean those stretch rollers regularly as well. That is most commonly the reason why we have poor plastic coverage, is that those stretch rollers get gummed up with all that tacky stuff off the wrap, and they don't roll as easily, and they're overstretching the plastic. So make sure that it's in an acceptable range of 50 to 70% stretch, and you can use a little ruler and make 2 marks an inch apart, and then run it through the stretcher, and if it's 1 3/4 inches or more, then you're definitely overstretching that plastic. So the next thing you want to do, and this is the most important part of this whole thing, is to make sure that our moisture levels are at 40 to 60%. This is really crucial. Again, referring back to some of my early work with alfalfa baleage here, if we are in that 40 to 60% range, notice here as we get closer to 60, our pH drop is quite good. We're down into the 4s here. Now notice here though, with low moisture, 40% moisture or below, in this case it was 37% moisture, we were above our pH 5. Our target really needs to be 5 or below. Now, moisture targets are often missed. Here's some work that was done in Kentucky. Jimmy Henning did some survey work with some county extension agents there. Some great information came from that, and what they found is that there's more samples that fall outside of that moisture target than fall inside of it. If you count up what's in the 40 to 60 range here, there's only about 27 that actually fall in there out of the 57 that were in this survey. So it's really, really important to pay attention to that detail. That's a crucial step. How do you determine moisture? That's not as easy as it sounds. There are some challenges in determining moisture, and one of those often used tools is a hay moisture probe. And those moisture probes will get you in the ballpark. Oftentimes, in some cases, they may not even be accurate enough for the high moisture levels. But those that really are designed for high moisture levels, they'll get you close, but they're really not extremely dependable. You really still need to calibrate your field. I would say in many cases, producers that have experience with this, once they're calibrated, they can be as accurate or maybe even more accurate. And this dish rag test, I think, is a really great tool too. So if you wring out a handful of forage and you can express water, if there are little droplets of water that come out of that dish rag as you wring out that forage, well, it's too wet in that case, and so you need to let it dry a little further. The microwave moisture test is a pretty common strategy, and that works if you've got a power source and a microwave near the location. Do not use your wife's microwave. Ask me how I know. That's an important consideration. You also need to consider using a drying oven or some device, like a coaster device, for example. That's basically a hair dryer on steroids, and one can use it to dry down the hay, and a scale dry down the forage, and a scale here you can use to measure. Once it gets down to stable weight, you can assess how much moisture was in it. Now, there are some built-in systems or add-ons that go into balers, and those systems can be quite accurate, although I've got a question mark here because there's not a lot of data on this, just some experiences that folks have reported to me that by the volume of material going through there, they've been able to pretty consistently get good numbers on moisture. Now, let's look at the effect of moisture content on lactic acid levels. As that moisture level increases, in general, we're going to see our lactic acid levels increase as well. Now, here is the recommended range, 40 to 60%. So if we're in that range, we're going to have some decent level of lactic acid here. Now, even all of these numbers from Dr. Koblentz's work here at our Dairy Forage Research Center up in Marshfield, you know, really those levels are still quite low. That's not nearly what we would see for silage in a bunk. Here's some survey data that, again, from county agents in Kentucky, kind of summarized by Jimmy Henning, and some great work here where they looked at the green dots here represent lactic acid levels. And yeah, as we get in that above 60% moisture, we're going to actually increase our lactic acid levels. However, we'll see in a moment that's not necessarily an ideal situation. Let's come back to that but for right now, notice that if we're in that 40 to 60% range, we're getting a fair amount of lactic acid formation. pH is dropping down at least near 5. And so there are some real important numbers here to see that if we're in that 40 to 60% range, we're doing well. Now let's take just a side note here and talk about botulism for a moment. The fear of botulism, I think, is a major barrier against producers adopting the use of baleage, and this is a risk that really can be kept under control if we keep our moisture on target, and that's really the key. If the pH in the silage fails to drop low enough, a secondary fermentation can occur. And a secondary fermentation is when there's enough moisture to support fermentation, but the pH is still pretty high, and whatever sugar and lactate may be available can be used by other anaerobic bacteria for energy. And one of the things that comes as a side effect of that is butyric acid and carbon dioxide loss. That's dry matter loss, basically, is what's happening. So you're losing valuable forage there. Now, a common soil bacteria, Clostridium Botulinum, is one of those that can contribute to that secondary fermentation. Now, Clostridium botulinum also produces the botulinum toxin, one of the world's most potent neurotoxins. And this is an extremely dangerous situation if we end up with a botulism case. So let's look at butyric acid because it's usually our best indicator of botulism, at least the risk of botulism. So here we have moisture on the x-axis and butyric acid on the y-axis, and we want these numbers to be as low as possible here. We want low, low, low butyric acid numbers. If we're in that recommended range, the higher we go here, the greater the risk of botulism that we're going to see, right? So let's look at some actual data from a compilation of studies that Dr. Koblenz did here at the Dairy Forage Research Center. And what you can see is as we get above that range, then our risk of having higher levels of butyric acid are quite significant. And so what we really want to do is stay within that range, try to keep our risk as low. The proportion of these samples that ended up having some level of butyric acid are much lower as we go lower in moisture. Here's some survey work, again, from Dr. Henning and the county agents there in UK Extension. Some really good information here looking at butyric acid levels. And notice the scale is a little different than the previous graph, but notice here, again, as we go higher, the more dangerous the situation is. So if we're in that 40 to 60% range, our risk is much, much lower than if we are out about 70% or so. The other thing we want to do is to make sure we avoid the risk of contaminating that forage with soil. We want to adjust our harvest equipment to minimize soil contamination, and that's especially important with the cutting height and the angle of the disc mower. We also want to be less aggressive with the rake and adjusting that rake so that it is just touching above the surface and not actually scratching the soil as much. We want to use a rotary rake or a merger rather than a wheel or parallel bar rake. We want to also test our baleage for quality, including measures of our fermentation. So we want to take that sample about 1 month after wrapping so that it has plenty of time to ferment, or up to about 30 days before feeding. Now, I prefer doing it a little closer to feeding, so right at about 30 to 60 days is my preference, so that we have time to make any changes in the feeding program appropriately. Now, again, anytime you're taking forage samples, you want to take a good number of cores and about a minimum of 20 cores per sample to really represent that, that forage lot. Be sure to tape up the holes with good Baleage tape again, excluding as much oxygen as possible. And here, as we look at the fermentation quality ideals, this is what we're shooting for. We want a pH below 5. We want lactic acid as high as possible, but at least above 3%. Butyric acid as low as possible, possibly lower than 0.1% would be ideal, but the lower the better. Ash content, which is a measure of how much soil contamination we got. We want that to be less than 10%. So in summary, Baleage has many advantages, and it can be very cost effective, especially for medium and large scale producers. Success with Baleage requires paying attention to the details though. And Baleage is not without risks, but good management keeps those risks low, especially good moisture management. Always, always, always test your Baleage quality, even if every detail went just as planned. We want to make sure that we're doing a good job of ensuring that the quality of feed that we're providing our animals is sufficient to their needs and won't cause any kind of negative effects. So with that, I'm happy to address any questions that you might have. Here's my contact information if you'd like to contact me after the fact. Thank you very much.
All right, Dennis, thank you for that outstanding presentation. Is there any questions for Dennis on Baleage?
Dennis, I think you saw the question about the cost to wrap a 5x5 roll.
Yeah, you know, the cost is going to vary a little bit. I have to give the extension answer, right? It depends. It depends on if it's an inline wrapped bale or an individually wrapped bale. Your plastic cost is probably going to be in the neighborhood of you know, probably about $4 to $6 per bale. With your wrapper costs is going to need to be added to that, labor cost added to that. So, you know, it's not a insignificant amount of money per bale. You're probably talking in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 per bale is what you would have in it.
What about small critters, rabbits, and so on?
Well, they pose a couple different challenges. Sometimes, no matter what we do to try to avoid it, sometimes we bale those little critters up in the bales. And that can actually have some real serious consequences, not only for the animal that gets baled up, of course, but also for what we feed that to, because there's one other disease challenge, anti-quality factor, which is listeriosis. And that often can come from, you know, gut-derived bacteria that can cause problems. Botulism might also be a possibility in that scenario too, particularly again if the moisture level is very high. So those instances are relatively rare. Now, as far as damage to the plastic, that's probably the more common case where we would have some damage to the plastic associated with some of those wildlife issues. You know, a mouse is probably not going to do much damage to a Baleage bale. However, the coyote that might be chasing that mouse, or you know, climbing up on top of the bales to try to get a good vantage point to pounce on that mouse, could cause some problems. And I've definitely seen that over my career. Honestly, probably the worst case scenario that I've ever encountered was the two-legged vandal, two-legged pest. We had a producer in Georgia once that had about 150 round rolls in an inline wrapped line, and some yahoo got a wild hair with a pocket knife and went down through the whole 150 bales and peeled the plastic off of it. So that's kind of the worst case scenario, but It's not uncommon, of course, for pest problems to result in holes in that plastic. The key thing there is to, choose a good site and then patch any holes as you see them, and be checking it regularly for that.
What is secondary fermentation, Dennis?
Secondary fermentation, to understand what secondary fermentation is, we need to focus on what is primary fermentation, or the initial fermentation. And the products of the initial fermentation are lactic acid, among other things. And then secondary fermentation is where that some bacteria will use lactic acid as their food source, and they'll convert that to other things, and you end up with butyric acid, which is one of those indicators of spoilage or secondary fermentation. And also, butyric acid is an indicator of botulism. Usually we don't have that problem if the pH of the silage has dropped enough to stop those clostridial bacteria from acting on that substrate. So we need that pH down into the 4s, if at all possible, to avoid that risk of clostridial bacteria creating a secondary fermentation. Just because you get that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have botulism, but those are correlated. They are related to one another, and the higher the butyric acid level, the higher the risk there is of botulism.
Dennis, I had a question. It seems like more producers are ensiling forage that is higher in dry matter. And almost some producers seem to be using it as a rain management mechanism. So when the hay's almost dry enough to bale, but not quite dry enough, they'll wrap it to avoid rain. What's a negative of doing that?
Well, when we're dealing with that low of a moisture, once we drop below about 40% moisture, it's not going to ferment really well. You'll have a little bit of a smell, a fermentation smell, if you've wrapped it up with plastic and no oxygen's getting in. But it really doesn't ferment well. And once you start feeding those bales, they will really start molding pretty quickly. An interesting new development, actually, that Wayne Koblentz in our center just actually presented at the AFGC meeting earlier this week, and he's going to be publishing more on this soon. But what he did is that he actually baled some material that was dry or drier. It wasn't dry enough to make hay, but it wasn't wet enough to make silage out of it. And he applied regular old hay preservative and then wrapped it up. And especially for hay damaged forage. Okay, for example, you get it about 30% moisture. You're about 2 hours, 3 hours maybe from getting it dry enough to make hay off of it. And the weatherman pulls a funny one on you, and now the rain is coming, and it gets rain damage on it. What he showed was if you go in with one of those hay preservatives and apply a sufficient rate of that, you can then subsequently wrap it up and actually have really good stable forage afterwards. And so once you open those bales up, they don't mold. They feed really well. Even after he took the plastic off and let them set outside for 11 days after they had gone through a storage phase, and those bales that had been treated with a hay preservative and then wrapped up like that were still without very much mold even after 11 days. So that's a new development that might help in that kind of niche where it's not quite dry enough to make hay, but you're chasing the rain and trying to get it all done. That might be a strategy to help kind of salvage it.
Do we have any more questions for Dennis?
Got 2 or 3 more. How many do we have time for, Chris?
Let's just take 2 more and then we'll move on to our last and best presenter, Jimmy.
Yeah. So besides end bale loss from open ends, how far up the row are bales damaged?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I have to give the extension answer. It depends. It depends on how dense those end bales are and how much deterioration occurs. It's not uncommon at all for 2 bales deep, at least, to be deteriorated to a point you really can't feed them. When you start doing the math on what that's going to cost you or what that value is that you're leaving there, it's a pretty significant amount of money that you're costing yourself by doing that. So those end caps are valuable. And even short of that, if you can, I mean, I've seen producers just take the rolls off and by hand they would go around the outside, the flat side of that bale to try to use that instead of an end cap. That's better than nothing. And certainly whatever you can do to prevent oxygen from getting in would be really crucial though.
Okay. And last one, when you talked about a medium or large scale producer or the economics of it, do you have in mind how big that is?
Yeah, keep going back to the extension answer. It depends, right? In general, what we found in an economic analysis I did with Ross Pruitt from LSU and Kurt Lacey, who is now at Mississippi State University, we found that roughly speaking, an individual wrapping system, about 100 cows, 100 brood cows or so, you would be able to pencil that and own the equipment. About 125 to 130 cow operation is what it would take to own and operate an inline wrapped baling system. To that, I would add, many of the producers that I've worked with over the years that bought wrappers didn't just use it on their own farm. They often would do some custom wrapping for their neighbors or something like that. It would maybe not a whole lot of it, but enough to help pay the bill on that wrapper. And it all depends on what your equipment costs are as to whether or not you can make it pencil. Good managers with low debt levels on some of their equipment, et cetera, that might be much lower than that, maybe down around 75 cows or something like that would be a profitable range. For stocker operators or something like that, we didn't actually specifically look at that, but the value of that that higher quality from baleage is much more valuable to a stocker operator, and so it's a little bit easier to make it pencil with a stocker operator than with a cow-calf operation.
All right. Well, we need to move on and make sure we get finished up at not too late of a time tonight. So before we introduce our last speaker, we're going to go ahead and have a message from our sponsors. And then we'll introduce our last speaker and get started with his presentation.
Hi, my name is Tyler Clark with My Team Cattle and Crop Insurance. While we can't yet meet in person, we're a proud sponsor of the Kentucky Cattlemen's Association. With offices in Lexington, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, we help livestock producers in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama with all of their agricultural insurance needs, including drought and rainfall insurance, animal mortality, general farm policies, and livestock price risk protection. Give us a call today. Happy New Year.
All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, and that's Dr. Jimmy Henning. Dr. Henning is an extension professor and extension forage specialist at the University of Kentucky, and he works with Dr. Ray Smith and myself. And I'll have to say that it's really a pleasure working with Jimmy. Jimmy's been around for a little while. Dennis and I were graduate students, and Jimmy was just the forage extension specialist then. And shortly after I left, he went into administration and he spent some time as associate dean. And when I came back in 2017, he returned to regular faculty and started to work again as a forage specialist. And it's been a real pleasure working with Jimmy over the years. Jimmy's a graduate of the University of Georgia and the University of Kentucky, and he worked as a forage extension specialist at the University of Missouri before returning to Kentucky. And again, he served as Associate Dean of Cooperative Extension from 2007 to 2017. We're very happy to have Jimmy back working as a forage extension specialist in Kentucky. And with that, I'll let Jimmy talk about practical approaches to improving hay quality in the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Good evening. I'm happy to join you tonight to talk about practical approaches to improving hay quality. My name is Jimmy Henning, and I'm a forage specialist at the University of Kentucky. I want to walk through several things that I think apply to getting a good cutting of hay. And number one is a good forage stand. And the target there is to get and to maintain a thick stand of desirable forage species like this novel endophyte tall fescue field in Madison County. I want to focus on one particular part of getting a good stand and keeping a good stand as it relates to hay quality, and that is don't skimp your way to a problem, and I'm talking about the fertility. I'm running into more and more cases where we see a soil test like this, where the phosphorus is adequate to high, but the potassium is extremely low. And the pH may or may not be bad, but the point I want to make is get a soil test. If you don't have a soil test, you don't have a strategy for keeping your forage stand vigorous, and it's almost like having two strikes against you before you start to make hay. I want to remind you that one of the reasons why that we are seeing these low potash numbers is the fact that we remove potassium at about 3 times the rate that we do phosphorus in a ton of hay. And if we're not putting it back in that ratio, then typically we are removing more than the soil is able to supply, and you will see a drop in soil test potassium numbers. I want to focus on one particular small demonstration study that we did in Powell County over the last 3 years, and we had fertility treatments on this low potassium site from no treatment at all to very high rates of nitrogen, replacement rates of phosphorus, and high rates of potassium. And what you see in front of you is one of the high fertility areas, and I'll outline that with my cursor, in the fall, compared to some of the lower fertility areas to the left and to the right. And you can obviously see that this field started out with a major broom sedge problem, and on those unfertilized or not well fertilized plots, we still had it. And you might argue that those fertility rates were too high to be affordable, and you might be right. But what I want to show you is that we saw considerable effects of the NP and K in the very first year of fertilization alone. If you look at the graph on the left, we had about 1.6 tons of total yield per acre with no fertility at all. With adequate NP and K, we had 3.8 tons. But the real surprise to us was the percent broom sedge in that very first year. Where we had adequate NP and K, we only had 14% broom sedge stand. Where we had no additional NP and K, the stand was 90% broom sedge, and that's 90% broom sedge by weight, as measured in the October harvest. And one other thing that we saw, we had treatments in this study that had the potassium and the phosphorus, or the P and the K, but no nitrogen. Now, and we did not add any clover to this trial, but look at the clover numbers on the plots that had P and K, but no nitrogen applied. You can see that where we had no NP or K, that we had 10 to 14%, 10% the first year, 14 the next. Where we had adequate P and K, we had 28% volunteer red clover the first year, 65% volunteer red clover the second year, and that's by visual analysis. One of the practical steps to getting good hay is controlling weeds. And weed control is certainly about product, but it's also about timing. And I'm choosing to show you a picture of buttercup here because buttercup is one of those weeds that once you see it, and you know you see it, most of the time it is past time to do anything about it. And I want to highlight a publication that I think you ought to have and keep close by, and that's AGR 207, Broadleaf Weeds of Kentucky Pastures. It has pictures on the front, and that's good, but really the real important part is on the back, where it lists the weeds and the preferred time of treatment and the product. And I've circled buttercup, and you can see that the preferred treatment time is February and March, and there are quite a few choices for herbicides that give good control. Now, of course, the challenge with using herbicides in February or March is catching that warm day where the temperatures are warm enough for the herbicide to be active. But I just want to make the point that if weed control is not about seeing it and then spraying, but knowing when to look for it and when to spray. And of course, one of the very major things about getting a good hay cutting or a good high quality hay is to cut early. And of course, if you've been to any forage meeting probably ever that talked about hay, we talk about the fact that stage of maturity is the big factor. It is the most important factor affecting forage quality. And we want to try to catch the forage at that changeover from vegetative to reproductive, like you see on the right with that pearl millet plant. Now, I want to acknowledge that this is a complex thing. If it was easy, anybody could have done it. But I also want to acknowledge that the reason why we don't get that done many times is because there are many things competing for your top priority on the farm. And this picture of tobacco being set and then cutting your hay crop just reminds me of that. Now, we have less competition from tobacco on many of our farms than we used to, but many things will compete for your time. And I also want to say that just because this farmer in this particular picture is cutting hay that's mature, that does not mean it's bad hay. There are no bad hays, only bad diets. Sometimes we do need to make cow hay, but the big mistake is not to test it, and the big mistake is not to feed appropriately. So there are no bad hays, just bad diets. And of course, I really want to acknowledge that the enemy of cutting early or cutting on time is rain. Now, rain is good. I'd hate to buy in the form of irrigation all of the moisture that we get in Kentucky in a year. It'd be nice to time it a little better for sure, but first cuttings are hurt by rainfall, and that's one of our biggest challenges to cutting early. I've got 5 strategies or 5 ideas I'd like to share with you about avoiding rain damage, and none of them are foolproof, but they may resonate with you and help you to devise a strategy that will help you have better hay across the board. Number 1, be ready early. There have been several years where, and nearly every year, there's a pattern of good weather in that late April or early May where there's some few good days or a few days in a row of good sunshine and temperatures. And if you're ready to cut hay and can lay it down then we have a better chance of getting it up. You might want to consider hay preservatives. These are not simple or cheap to use, and they're only good for that moisture range that's just above our safe baling moistures. The products that you would then use that are most research proven are the propionic acid products, but they will help you avoid heating and molding in hay that's just slightly above safe baling moisture. And of course, making haylage is an option, and we know that making haylage is one of the very best ways to avoid rain damage and not need 4 curing days in a row. Another thing that you might consider is, over time, changing to a summer forage for hay. That may be, if you are in the southern part of the state, you may choose to use Bermuda grass. You may choose to invest in getting a native warm season grass. Maybe alfalfa that you might make baleage with in the first cutting, and then use those summer cuttings then for some of your higher quality hay needs. And the last one is manage for a fall hay cutting. It seems to be happening more and more frequently that we get enough rainfall and good weather in the fall that we're able to put up quite a lot of high quality hay, high quality grass hay in particular, in the fall. Another way, and it's a very important way to raise your quality of your hay, is to use legumes. Now, legumes are like your secret weapon, and here's why I say so. We want to add legumes to hay fields because they are high yielding, especially the tall growing legumes like red clover and alfalfa. Red clover and alfalfa and white clover too will add nitrogen to the soil. Now, they don't do it immediately. They do it over time, and it's recycled, not just shared directly with the grass, but they do add nitrogen to the system. And they give us not only yield, but they give us seasonal yield. They're more productive in summer than typically our grasses are. They are, of course, higher in protein and especially higher in energy. And red clover in particular has, as we are learning, high quantities of the isoflavone biocanon A, which is able to directly offset the vasoconstriction problems associated with grazing or eating toxic tall fescue. So legumes are an important strategy in your practical ways to improve hay quality. And I want to mention quickly too that our manipulation of hay is going to matter, how we manipulate it. Tedding and raking carefully is important. Of course, tedders are instruments that we use to fluff up the hay and get more air movement throughout the swath. And of course, we need to use rakes, whether they're wheel rakes or bar rakes, to move the forage into a windrow for baling. But I want to at least remind you that we want to manipulate the hay when there is some moisture present, because as you can see in this picture, when we are raking hay, like this alfalfa grass hay on our research farm in Lexington, when it is pretty dry, you can see that cloud of dust behind the tractor, and that's actually little fine leaf particles. So when we manipulate it too dry, we have larger amounts of leaf shatter, and the leaf is where the high quality materials are. One of the practical concerns we don't want to forget about is to manage storage losses. And managing losses in storage is a multifaceted task, and it starts with actually baling it as the correct moisture content, because we know that the wetter we put up hay, the more the storage loss. And we know we lose about, the percent storage loss that we have is going to be equal to the difference between the moisture at baling and the equilibrium moisture that the hay gets down to. Managing storage losses, though, most of the time is managing weather damage. And I gotta love the producer in Cumberland County that the top picture was taken where he had the commitment that he was going to stop that rain from getting into his hay bales or her hay bales by putting tin over it and weighting that down with rocks. Unfortunately, we're learning that most of the moisture then comes in from the bottom parts of the bale. So a strategy of putting something under the bales, like the tires in the picture below, is actually more sound than stopping the rain from coming in from the top. The picture on the bottom, of course, she's using net wrap as well, and net wrap also sheds some water compared to twine alone. But covered storage, of course, is best, and where you're have been able to build many of these hoop structures across Kentucky, and they are excellent for storing hay. And the last point I want to make is to feed the forage efficiently. Don't do all the work to get good hay, get it put away, get it put in the barn, and then give it away when we feed it. And I just want to highlight some extremes possibly in hay feeding and losses. Certainly a lot of loss in the picture at the top, and then a hay ring feeder, which is good, or a ring feeder that has sheeting around the bottom, which is even better. But there are many, many ways to feed hay, and there are reasons to do so. The point that I think we want to make here is that choose the one that works for your system, that allows you to get the most advantage from the work that you have done to create and to harvest and to store good hay. So when you talk about practical approaches to improving hay quality, here are my list of things to do. Get and maintain a good forage stand. Cut as early as you can. Use legumes wherever possible. Don't ted and don't rake or don't manipulate the hay when it's too dry. Use the proper storage, the best you can get, and feed it efficiently. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Jimmy, for that outstanding presentation on practical considerations for making high quality hay. Is there some questions for Jimmy?
Chris, I see one about moisture content for hay, and I talked about that a little bit in the presentation about there are safe moisture contents, and that moisture content will vary with the type of bale you're making. For our small rectangular bales, 18 to 20% moisture is the acceptable range. You get into the round bales, and we'd like to get them to 15 to 16% moisture. And some of the larger rectangular package, you'd like to get them drier than that. So it varies with the bale size, and reaching those moistures is sometimes hard in our humid conditions.
Okay. Is there any other questions for Jimmy?
Says, when they're in frost seeding in the next few weeks, can I frost seed grass seed with any luck? Well, I'm glad I've got all my forage friends on the line, so I can pass that off to Ray or Chris and let them prognosticate about that.
Blake, generally we say that it doesn't work as well with grasses. So it's ideal for red clover and white clover, and not so ideal for alfalfa, and not so ideal for grasses. If you want to broadcast grass seed and you want to try to enhance your chances of getting a stand, then dragging that pasture with some kind of a harrow following broadcasting may help to enhance soil to seed contact with your grass seed.
And they're pretty rare to find nowadays, but a cultipacking roller can help after you broadcast that grass on a roughed up pasture to help make sure you get that seed soil contact. I have got a couple that I'll take quickly. Chris, does UK have any information on recommended legumes as well as when to plant different types of forage? And yes, we do, Philip. And it's the publication I'd send you to first is AGR 18, which is our forage and crop seeding guide. And I will do my best to send you a link to that in the answer box, or if you want to get in touch with us offline, we can do that as well. Or your county agent can get that. I'll tell you how I get to that publication. I just go to my search window and type in AGR 18 and then space and UKY, and it will come up on top. So that would be where I would go, and it would give you lots of information about the type of forage you might plant, and also seeding dates and rates. Another question, how much better is it to use a disc bind versus a disc mower? And that's going to depend on the type of hay you're making. For hay that has stems, that would be red clover, alfalfa, summer annual grasses, then The mower conditioners are going to help you quite a bit by crushing or crimping those stems and helping them to dry down faster than they would have if you'd used just a plain disc mower. So, you know, the disc mower is a bit cheaper, and you may, you know, have less problems in operation. It won't plug up as easy, but there are some times where a mower conditioner is just going to be extremely helpful. And another one, when assessing an existing stand of hay and making fertilizer recommendations, is there a minimum % of good grass that should be there to make fertilizer worth applying? Well, now Tracy, that's a tough question, and it is a judgment call. You have to decide if there's a stand there. But I'll tell you, in my most recent experience with fertilizing grass stands, I started out with what looked like mainly a broom sedge stand, and by putting on the right amount of fertility, I was amazed at how much cool season grass I really had. So you do have to make the assessment of, do I have something worth saving at the bottom? And that's going to be something where you're going to have to take a look. And we've made other calls where we said, no, the ragweed is 12 inches tall. It's totally bare underneath. We need to start over. So it's going to be a case by case decision, and it can go either way.
So there was a question, Jimmy, on it says thoughts on plastic wrapping dry hay for outdoor storage. So I would invite our other speakers, if you have something to bring into the discussion, to please mention that. That's something we're seeing more often, is taking dry hay and maybe putting a couple layers of wrap on it. I don't know what research there is to support that or not support that. Do you guys have any thoughts?
There's kind of a limited amount of research on that. Krishona Martinson, who is an equine researcher at University of Minnesota, partnered with Wayne Koblenz from our research center a few years ago, and they wrapped some orchard grass bales that were dry hay like that. And what they found is if they completely excluded the oxygen, they wrapped it just like they were wrapping for baleage, you know, total wrap, that they didn't get any mold or heating damage, which was really beneficial. There may still be some moisture condensation that will occur around the outside, that right as it contacts the plastic. You may still get a little bit of condensation there and a little bit of sliminess when you open up that bale. But if you completely exclude the oxygen, what they found is that it does a pretty good job of mimicking what would happen in a well ventilated barn. You're basically choking off the oxygen from the fungi that would be doing any kind of mold growth in that bale.
Okay.
There's a question about fall applications of potash, good or not so good. And I would say it would totally depend on the soil test that you've got for that field. But we do know that if we apply potash, large amounts of it, early on in the crop season, that you can get luxury consumption, and a lot of that can be taken off at the very next hay cutting. So I do like to split apply potash, some in the fall, for that reason. It lets a greater chance for it to be taken up by the plant and not just disappearing in the next cutting.
So could you just define luxury consumption, Jimmy, for those not familiar with that term?
You bet. I mean, the plant does not, luxury consumption is where the plant takes up more than it needs. So it's like you sucked up sweet sugar at the bottom of a glass of sweet tea that didn't dissolve. You get a slug of sugar that you didn't need, and that is in the plant then, and it's distributed in the plant and held there until it's harvested. So it's more than the plant needs, and of course that means it doesn't hang around to do things like help the crown be winter hardy, give the plant more disease resistance and so on.
My Hopkins County definition of luxury consumption is it's like me when I go to a Chinese buffet. You know, I load up that plate and I fill it up and I get so full that I'm miserable the rest of the day.
All right. Do we have any other questions for the panelists? All right, so I guess we can go ahead and adjourn, and we're going to turn it over to Becky Thompson. Remember, we've got $100. I don't know how she's going to give it out because I can't draw a piece of paper out of a box, but I'm sure she's got a method, and I'm sure it's
a method. Well, first of all, I want to say a thank you again to our convention sponsors. We really do appreciate their support. Our speakers had great presentations this evening and some fantastic information for our Kentucky cattlemen. I do appreciate our attendees sticking with us this evening, and I'm happy to say that the winner of the $100 is Nancy Colentrup. Nancy will be reaching out to you via email tomorrow to get your contact information to get your check to you. Also, as a reminder, we will be sending out an email to all of our attendees and anyone who registered with links to all the videos soon, along with a survey that will allow you to give us feedback on tonight's conference, as well as suggesting any speakers or topics you'd like to see this group cover in the future. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chris, and you can wrap us up. Chris, you're muted.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers for being with us, and I'd like to especially thank Becky for organizing everything so well. This was so much better organized than when Jimmy did our grazing conference ourselves. So thanks, Becky. We really appreciate that.
Yes, Becky, thanks.
I did see one more question on here. It was about whether Jimmy, whether if we're going to renovate a pasture, whether we should be doing tillage or using a burn down herbicide and a no-till drill. That might just be interesting for a lot of people if you want to answer that. Or Dennis.
Yes, I would say that if you're going to try to reestablish a grass, and especially if it's the fescue and you're going to something else, then a clean start is going to be what you need. And you can till or you can spray herbicide. Tillage is problematic on most of the pasture land that we have because of hills. So, you know, the no-till with the herbicide burn down is probably the option we turn to most frequently for changing the base stand of grass.
All right. Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks, and thanks for joining us tonight. We're happy to have you.